Good morning, everyone. I love this fantastic crowd that we have at 8:30 in the morning, rise and shine. But this is all to discuss and to dialogue about a very important issue of today. I am the Dean of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management and Urban Policy here at the New School. My name is Michelle DePass. Milano as a school has always had an unwavering commitment to creativity, engaged learning, diversity, heterodoxical thinking, and scholarship that meets academic standards, but also, and more importantly, meets public relevance. So I would like to welcome you to Ferguson and Staten Island, the roots, the reality, and the response. There are certain moments in one's life that stays with you forever. And the events of this past summer punctuated for me a lifelong dedication to making the system accountable. When I was an Ella Baker Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, I found myself working on a police brutality case where a young, unarmed black man died at the hands of the Ossining police. Every day, I looked at bullet pathways, autopsy reports, talked to witnesses, and poured over evidence. None of that brought back this young man to his family. What does it mean to be black in America today? In America, we have a black president, who I've had the honor of serving as a presidential appointee, and a black attorney general, leading this administration for the past 6 years. But this administration is still sending weapons to suburbs to fuel the new Jim Crow. What does it mean in America when we have an attorney general in this country that cannot fight and eradicate racism? This may or may not be cases of racist cops, but we do know that these two tragic deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown are the result of a system that has gone terribly wrong. How do we tear this system down? We still have to tell our sons, I will have to tell my son, to be careful because you may get shot because you're black. When you have a white police force going into the streets with armored tanks against protesters, something has gone terribly wrong. Our police have been militarized in this drug war, which is used to oppress and suppress black communities. I've been left to wonder, either we as a nation do not want to do anything to fix this, or we can't do anything to fix this. That's the really scary possibility. How many unarmed black people are shot every year? Why was Ferguson different? Why should we have to protest every time something like this gets attention? How will we stop the senseless acts of violence? I want to thank Rembrandt Brown, Committeewoman Bynes, Peter Coy, Eugene O'Donnell, and Vincent Warren for coming to the New School this morning and helping us channel our questions and deep emotions into a constructive dialogue that will hopefully answer some questions that many of us have been asking ourselves for the last few months. I want to thank the Center for Constitutional Rights for co-sponsoring this important event, and thank the Center for New York City Affairs for rallying quickly to put this dialogue on. And I especially want to thank Jeff Smith, our indomitable Missouri transplant who worked hard with me to present this morning to you. I give you Jeff Smith.
Thank you so much, Dean DePass. Last month, the world was riveted by images coming from Ferguson, Missouri. And while many analysts correctly identified some of the underlying issues, one question went unanswered. What is it about St. Louis's unique history, economics, politics, leadership structure, and culture that set it apart from the many other cities that had quietly endured similar tragedies? What type of self-inflicted damage unique to St. Louis lay at the root of its trials and tribulations? Why didn't Staten Island, or Sanford, Florida, or any number of other communities that have watched unarmed black men like Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin die at the hands of police or white vigilantes also explode? And what types of solutions to St. Louis's ills might also apply to other communities. Many of us here in New York City watch the distressing images on television, but I imagine that few felt quite as powerless or as conflicted as I did. See, I grew up just a few minutes from Ferguson and spent much of my childhood playing basketball at parks and gyms in the area. Then I represented a Missouri State Senate district about a mile away from the spot where Michael Brown's body lay for over 4 hours on a humid August afternoon. I left my Senate seat 5 years ago last month, but ever since the first night when people massed in Ferguson's streets and let their anger pour out, I wanted to be home, and soon I went. Weeks after Mike Brown's death, the anger was still palpable and the air still thick with tension. I understood this because the St. Louis that I knew had been simmering for decades. Most of my high school teammates that I still kept up with were woefully underemployed, yet they considered themselves lucky relative to their friends and siblings and cousins who were in even worse shape. And just like 25 years ago, they still avoided driving through Ferguson and Florissant and Bell Ridge and many of the North County towns that are guilty of so much of what we've read about, so much of the profiling. After many nights spent groveling in these towns' traffic courts, they were only too glad to take a 15-minute detour. I was back last month for one of my teammates' 40th birthdays, and he looked like he was 50. In the old days, I would have kidded him about this mercilessly, but Ferguson had finally helped me understand the stress of living a life under siege. The constant stops were really just the byproduct of a putrid mix of municipal fragmentation, economic hardship, and racism. And together, these produced an extreme over-reliance on traffic stop-generated revenue that we've now read about and that we'll discuss today, whereby some municipalities in St. Louis County generate as much as half of their annual revenue just from traffic tickets. Of course, the region's problems went much deeper than this. The decimation of the auto manufacturing sector, the exodus of corporate headquarters, the stripping of accreditation from the city's public schools, it all contributed to the feeling that the city was unraveling, duct taped together by some stimulus money here or some philanthropy there, but never really fixed. And we policymakers, we dealt mostly with the symptoms, I'm ashamed to say. It was almost inconceivable, given the budget constraints under which we operated, to address the root causes. A stagnant economy, a dropout rate that approached 70% in some areas, that left most unprepared for jobs, the widespread availability of handguns, and the nihilism of many young men who'd seen far too much violence in their lives and didn't expect to see 30. The symptoms of this I saw every day. During the summer of 2008, as the economy tanked and the murder rate spiraled out of control, the 10 neighborhoods home to the most murders in St. Louis all lay within my Senate district. In some of them, male unemployment hovered over 50%, and there was a 1 in 500 chance of being murdered each year. So one night I asked a police officer if I could join him on his beat, and he agreed. I did 2 weeks of all-night ride-alongs to try to understand things from his perspective. From the minute we left the station, our car was in demand. The wire crackled, and we responded to all types of events. The dispatcher's description did not always resemble what was actually happening at the scene, fueling the mix of adrenaline and anxiety upon arriving. Police did their best to comfort victims and listen to witnesses. Particularly trying were victims and witnesses who painted vivid descriptions of a crime, but would not name the offender. Of course, the police often played their own games, cutting deals with prostitutes or junkies to try to extract information, and often lying to suspects about what they did or did not know. I accompanied various officers every night for 2 weeks, and I saw many gruesome scenes. One that stands out in my mind was a scene in which 4 young children were forced out of their apartment because of an incident and were in our police car in the back seat while their parents were being interrogated at about 4 in the morning. I thought about how terrified I'd have been as a toddler had my family's house been surrounded by 10 cop cars at 4 a.m. I asked one of the kids if he was okay, and he looked at me blankly, dazed by the commotion and the squad cars' blinking lights. Blinding lights, and he told me, "I just want to go back to sleep." At the end of my 2 weeks, I was more confused than ever. Most of the cops seemed like decent guys doing their best in a difficult environment, and most of the suspects seemed like decent guys who'd been dealt a bad hand, had maybe grown up like that exhausted child, and had then had a run of even worse luck, and had finally surrendered to it. But what struck me more than anything was that police spent all night, every night, dealing with people who weren't in good shape. And the experience of dealing with down-on-their-luck white people affected them very differently from the experience of dealing with down-on-their-luck black people. The experience of dealing with down-on-their-luck white people did not seem to leave a visible racial imprint on black or white cops, but their experience with black suspects did. You could tell in the skeptical tones they used in dealing with them, their body language, the level of escalation that they felt was warranted, and occasionally their disparate use of force itself. In the past month, we've seen it happen over and over again. Unarmed black men shot, choked, often killed by fearful white officers. After my experience doing ride-alongs, I try not to jump to conclusions. But it's hard to avoid a pretty simple fact. None of these men, not Mike Brown, not Eric Garner, not Kajimi Powell, not John Crawford at the Walmart in Beaver Creek, Ohio, none of them deserved to die. That sentiment seems to describe the feelings of many of those massed in Ferguson as we speak, whose mayor recently opined that there is no history of racial tension here. The protesters, more than anything, that I spoke with a few weeks ago in St. Louis, want white St. Louis to ditch the knee-jerk paternalism and actually hear their message. They want white St. Louis to finally make an effort to grapple with its shameful racial history, one in which a complex alchemy of private decisions and public policies conspired to leave North St. Louis County divided by race and class. They want to win some agency over their own lives instead of being at the mercy of forces that have so often let them down or actively impeded them. And most of all, they want law enforcement to recognize that black bodies have value. Though St. Louis may differ from Staten Island and all the other places that have seen similar killings, it has much in common with many places that have not yet exploded, but might. Today we explore the conditions, the policies, and the psychology underlying the unrest in Ferguson, and we ask what other cities might learn from it so that they may begin addressing the root causes of some of these problems instead of making feeble attempts to salve the symptoms. Thank you to everyone on the panel for being here to join us today in this exploration. I'd like to introduce everyone on the panel, and we'll start closest to me with Vince Warren. Vince is the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a national legal and educational organization dedicated to advancing and defending the rights guaranteed by the Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It sounds simple, I know, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
It's a lot of work.
He oversees CCR's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work, which includes using international and domestic law to hold companies and government officials accountable for human rights abuses, challenging racial, gender, and LGBT injustice, and combating the illegal expansion of U.S. presidential power and policies such as illegal detention at Guantanamo. Prior to his tenure at CCR, he was a national staff attorney with the ACLU, where he litigated civil rights cases focusing on affirmative action, racial profiling, and criminal justice reform. And prior to that, he monitored South Africa's historic Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and worked as a criminal defense attorney for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. Vince, thank you so much for joining us today. Next on the panel is Eugene O'Donnell. Professor O'Donnell is at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He served as a police officer with the NYPD, receiving 14 department awards for outstanding police service while working in Brooklyn. Later, after getting his law degree, he was appointed as an assistant DA in the Queens District Attorney's Office, and later served as a senior prosecutor and supervisor in the Kings County DA's office. He's also been director of intake and advocacy at the Law Enforcement Division of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. He was coordinator of the New York State Law Enforcement Executive Institute from 2005 to 2008, is a certified New York State police trainer, has been a police academy instructor, has taught in the criminal investigation course for New York City detectives, and his op-ed pieces have been published by the New York Times, the Daily News, the Post, Newsday, Philadelphia Inquirer, and a list that's too long for me to read here. He also contributes to Newsweek and frequently appears on MSNBC and several other national television stations. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Committeewoman Patricia Bynes is a Ferguson Township Democratic Committeewoman. She was one of the earliest supporters of then-Senator Barack Obama in the spring of 2007 and traveled to Iowa many times in the run-up to the 2008 Iowa caucuses. That was her formative experience, as far as I know, in electoral politics, even though she's been really engaged in her community wherever she's lived across the country for much longer than that. But that was the experience that inspired her to get engaged locally and run for Ferguson Township Committeewoman. In her day job, she's an operations and procurement specialist for the United States Department of Agriculture, and she is a native of Staten Island. So there's interesting symmetry to Patricia's life. Next, thank you for coming all the way from Ferguson, Patricia. Rembert Brown is a staff writer for Grantland. His reportage includes topics as diverse as his firsthand account on the front lines in Ferguson, racial politics and professional basketball, and far beyond. He's based in New York, a native of Atlanta, Georgia, a graduate of Dartmouth College, where he earned a BA and studied sociology, geography, and public policy. He was actually an urban planning graduate student at one of our competitors here in New York City, but in his unhappiness, he started freelancing, which led to the job at Grantland. So I told him this morning he went to the wrong program. But it all worked out pretty well for him. Thanks for being here and for your wonderful writing about this. Peter Coy, finally, is the economics editor for Bloomberg Business Week and covers a wide range of economics issues. He also holds the position of senior writer. He joined the magazine in December 1989 as telecommunications editor, then became technology editor, and held that position until joining the economics staff. He came to Business Week from the AP in New York, where he had served as business news writer since 1985. Before that, he was a correspondent in AP's Rochester bureau. He began his career at the AP in 1980 as an editor for the Albany Bureau, and before that was a reporter for the Waterbury Republican. He has appeared on numerous television programs, including CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, among others, and holds a BA in history from Cornell University. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. So why don't we start with you, since we're with you, Peter, and if I'd like for all of you to just offer kind of a 2 or 3 minute summary of your response to what we've seen both in Ferguson, to the situation with Eric Garner in Staten Island, and just sort of the epidemic that we've seen over the last several months of, that was described in the introduction.
Well, first of all, I'm humbled to be in the presence of so many people who know a lot more about this than I do. I want to start out by saying that I wrote a cover story for Business Week. It was a quickie news story coming shortly after the shooting, and one of my sources that got me onto this was Jeff's own piece, op-ed piece in the New York Times, which talked about the fragmentation of St. Louis County. I looked into that more myself and wrote an online piece for businessweek.com, which led to my being contacted by Arch City Defenders, which is the public defender, more of a legal aid organization that has done a lot of the work, which we now all know about, on the disproportionate stopping of blacks for traffic, and then the jailing of people who can't pay their fines, which leads to, as you can imagine, a downward spiral in their lives. They lose their jobs, they lose their credit ratings, and it turns out to be a total disaster. So my cover story ended up kind of bringing together these two elements, the disparate racial treatment of blacks and whites by the cops and the court system, and the long, long history of fragmentation in St. Louis County, which goes back to the 19th century. I didn't even get to go to Ferguson myself for the story. I'm sorry about it. It was just a rushed job. Luckily, we had some Bloomberg reporters on the scene who were able to feed me information. But just one thought I will say before I turn over the mic, which is that, as Jeff said, and I believe as Dean DePass mentioned, these are national issues, but Ferguson is a unique place. You need to look at, I'm sure Committeewoman Bynes will talk about this. there were special factors in Ferguson which don't exist everywhere in the country. So while we're all talking about the degree to which we all care about this, we all are involved in this, we also need to think, what are the particularities that make Ferguson a particularly difficult problem?
Thank you very much, Peter. Robert?
Yeah, this one, yeah. My connection to Ferguson came very, very randomly because I was actually with a group of friends talking about the Garner case the Sunday night after everything happened down in Ferguson, and we were kind of talking about the beginning of kind of the media groundswell in Ferguson and how none of us, all people in the media, couldn't really figure out what to believe yet. Like, we saw a lot of photos, but we didn't know what the photos represented. We saw people tweeting, but we didn't know, like, with the exception of actually Committee Women Bynes and a couple other people who we knew were Ferguson residents, we didn't really know, you know, who to believe, who was down there for the right reasons, who was down there for the wrong reasons. And a couple of friends of mine, like just kind of off to the side, said, like, if someone we knew went down there, we would now know what to believe because we would trust that account. And that's kind of what convinced me to buy a plane ticket that night and go down there, like, unsure if it would be something I could ever write about for my website, or the website that I work for, because up until a month ago, it was firmly a sports and pop culture website that I've been working for, and I knew I had some leverage at the site after being there for a while, but I didn't know if I could convince them to publish something that was very much a news story, a reported story like that. And that pretty much was my thought process until that Wednesday night where things got really bad with the police and the residents and the handful of journalists that were down there. And that night when I returned to my hotel, and after having, like, a broken phone for 4 hours and seeing hundreds of emails from people seeing if I was alive or if I was okay, that's when I knew how serious this was, and that I had to write about it, and that this was like a popular culture issue. And that was like who became a journalist in Ferguson still is a really important takeaway, because you didn't need any credentials to be a journalist in Ferguson. You just needed to be down there. And I think that was something that was a really big, something that separated from the Garner case, something that I think made the Ferguson case a really special thing, because it really opened it up to anyone that had eyes and ears and any way to communicate with the public.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's really good to be here, and especially to be among Jeff, who kind of understands the politics of Ferguson and St. Louis County, because that is a lot of what makes what happened very different. I don't know if you all have been watching via live stream or on television any of the chanting that gets done with at the protests. United we stand, divided we fall. St. Louis County is very divided, even the St. Louis region itself. And when a lot of people started coming to the area to try to cover the story, I don't even know how many hours I spent trying to explain the lay of the land to national reporters, because St. Louis City is not a part of St. Louis County, and St. Louis County has 90 different municipalities, and municipalities are separate cities. They are different neighborhoods that have their own mayors, councils,
Fire departments in many cases. Police
Yeah,
departments.
many of them have their own fire departments. I think there are about 60 separate different police forces there. And if your municipality doesn't have enough money to raise its own fire department, there are fire boards. So there's all types of politics all over the place in St. Louis County. And then there's the never been addressed racial issue. And when I say never been addressed, racism in St. Louis it's very polite and passive aggressive. It's not in your face. I've lived in the South. I've lived down in Savannah, Georgia, and you know where most people are coming from. It's you can respect that. So I don't have to waste a lot of time. I don't have to waste a lot of time with formalities and politeness. It's very in your face and respectable, and it's very clear. St. Louis is very different. Well, I've also, funny enough, I was born in Staten Island. I actually went to school not too far from here, and I understand a lot of the diversity and even some of the racial tension here in the New York City area. But it's always open and it's discussed. St. Louis, there's no discussion. It's a lot of politeness. It's a lot of, I have a black friend. It's very polite. It's, my grandchildren are biracial, kind of racism where people do not get it. And they think that with nice dinners where they raise money for a foundation to help African American youth, they think that that's the answer, and it is not. So when you have this type of political structure that's very fragmented, where basically you have to prey on your residents for your revenue because you're a neighborhood. And then just the shooting itself. If you have not, I don't know if you've ever seen Canfield, but it was out in the open, his body laid out in the street for 4.5 hours in an apartment complex where you look out your window and you could just look down and you could see his body. So that fueled a lot of the tension just from that very first night. So between the backstory of St. Louis that's never dealt with its real issues, the political fragmentation that makes it very hard to get anything done, and then this very blatant shooting, that's how we got where we are now. And then, can't forget the response, the tanks, the tear gas. I do have a bulletproof vest. I go out with a bulletproof vest at the protest and a gas mask.
And just to touch on something Patricia said and Peter referenced, to give you a stark example of the fragmentation of St. Louis and the consequences, there's a town called Sycamore Hills, which has a section of interstate highway called 170. And it has a section that goes from about me to Dean to Pass. And so they have a policeman who just sits on the shoulder of the highway in that section with a radar gun. And that constituted, I think, 44% of the town's revenue last year. Right. So anyway, it's a 4x4 block town, but they employ, several people in their city hall who continue to have, I don't know how many people exactly, but 7 or 8 people, I think, in their city hall who have jobs year after year after year thanks to that radar gun, which, again, contributes to that simmering resentment on the part of many of its residents.
You have municipalities, but they don't have any businesses in them.
No.
The business is the radar gun.
Right.
And that's
only
the
houses.
revenue. Yeah.
It's just 4x4 blocks of houses in Sycamore Hills.
And they make sure they have a judge and a prosecutor to process that revenue.
Thank you. Professor.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Good morning. And it really is good to be at the new school. We're talking about politics and policy, which so much of this is really about. And just in terms of what Jeff just mentioned, obviously, this is anti-police also, right? The idea that the police have to be revenue collectors. I'm at a school, we're trying to get people to go into police service as a profession, and you're basically denigrating the entire profession, which is an important job, which has a lot of complexity to it. You're making the cops basically create, and obviously there's a failure to have a fair tax system, right? Which is at the fundamental core of this. Localities are starved of tax revenue, so we're basically making the cops into revenue agents. I'll just be very brief and perhaps a little counter to perhaps some of the other panelists.
That's why we invited you.
Yeah, no, and we have a brutal criminal justice system, but we should own it, right? We should stop pretending that it just exists. And we saw a lot of denial of the ownership of this with elected officials. Who they didn't know how the tanks got to Missouri, to Ferguson, right? They were shocked. Rand Paul was shocked to find out that this ended up on the streets of Ferguson. Hillary Clinton, I think, said, we're better than this. No, we're not. We're not better than this. This is the system. The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer in a brutal system. If anybody's ever been in a federal court and seen the power of federal judges, and by the way, the arbitrary, capricious way often that justice is doled out in a federal court. So I'll be brief because I think the interaction will be more interesting, but we shouldn't get so involved with the visceral. We don't get into the substantive, especially at a place like the new school. And we shouldn't, again, oversimplify. When you think of something like Staten Island and the Garner case, the reality is that calls keep coming in to the police nonstop. They're incessant. And in poorer communities, triply so. Because in Park Avenue and Sutton Place, they don't have these issues that they have to deal with the police on, right? Because they've got a doorman in the building. But when you talk about public housing, and I was a liaison of public housing in the Queen's DA's office, if anybody thinks that people in public housing are okay with people breaking the law, hanging out in the stairwells, drinking, smoke, they're not, okay? So those of us who consider ourselves progressives have to have some honesty in this conversation. I believe in the Garner case, 30 complaints on that corner about loose cigarettes. I have been very critical of that. I don't understand why street cops are doing cigarette enforcement in the city of New York. It is also a revenue issue, I guess, at the bottom of it. But we have to stop pretending it's not our brutal system. And our leadership has really pandered badly on some of this stuff. There's been a tremendous amount of bad pandering that's gone on, trying to make this a police issue and only a police issue, which takes us all the way away. Now, just final thing I want to mention, because I think there might have been a little loss of hope earlier. This president has played a very good role in a lot of ways that just don't get a lot of attention. And I'll mention one that I don't think got a lot of attention, maybe even in this room of people that closely follow things that really matter. He created now an infrastructure, a mental health infrastructure for returning veterans, right? Which I don't even think got that much publicity. If anybody deals with the police business, mental health is a giant issue. It's a giant issue. The jail system, I'm not telling anybody here things they don't know, but there's actually now a reliable mental health infrastructure finally for returning veterans. Would that we could create that for the larger population as a whole in a city like New York, where this is a major issue. Many of the worst police incidents, shootings have involved the mentally ill. We need to get the police, the footprint of the police, which is way too big in our country, we need to reduce it, but that's going to require political leadership, right? You're going to have to get into, we keep legislating. Jeff knows this. Every passing year, there's a new set of criminal laws. We don't take any off the books. We keep adding them. And these involve the police telling people what to do. And when the people demur and say, I won't do it, that's force, right? That's potentially force. And for us to say we don't know that or we're not aware of that is kind of disingenuous. So I will stop now. Hopefully the interactions will be robust here. Thank you.
That was pretty robust already. Thank you.
Sure.
Vince.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, Professor Smith and Dean DePass. It's wonderful to be here, everybody. Gosh, 3 to 4 minutes. So I'm going to start off by telling you what I want to talk about for the rest of the panel, that I won't get into the 3 or 4 minutes, but I actually want to frame this in the discussion as we tend to think of police-community relationships as a series of social interactions. Guy does this, cop does that. The community response is this, the arrest happens. But I want us to maybe think about it differently. Let's think about some of the things that we know are similar in Staten Island and Ferguson. One is in the Ferguson, it's the traffic court scenario where, as we've talked, it's essentially a black tax. When most of the people that come through or that are being stopped are black, they're paying an additional tax for these stupid traffic violations. And there's a connection between that and the stop and frisk policies in New York City that we're challenging, and even the broken windows, loose cigarettes policies that we were talking about in Staten Island. And I think if we think about this as a structure, as a system, a brutal system, part of a brutal system, rather than social interactions, we might get to a different place. So it's less about what Eric Garner did and didn't do, and it's less about what Michael Brown did or didn't do, and it's almost less about whether the cops were right to stop and to check people to begin with, but it actually turns into what does the structure mean when police officers overreact, when citizens react angrily? Is there an opportunity for us to actually create a space for de-escalation, or does it always have to escalate? In my view, is that from what I've seen, it almost always escalates. I wanted to just, okay, I'm not going to read this because I don't have time, Jeff. But I am going to talk about the way things go. There's a dance that we do societally after people are killed. Black men are killed by white police officers almost anywhere. And it kind of goes like this. It's that the media reports, from our perspective, not in the community. We're in New York and we hear about these other things. The media reports that there's a killing by the police. B, as the facts come out, or as they don't come out, outrage begins to grow in the communities in which the person was killed. C, the national media then picks up and hears about this, and they start to take on the story. After the national media begins to take on a story, that puts intense pressure on the local police. And what do the local police do? The local police start to create a criminality narrative, right? So it's a police shooting, and the only question is, why did this police officer shoot Michael Brown? But what we begin to hear back after the police shooting is we hear a lot of stuff about the victim. We hear about the mom, we hear about the dad, we hear about the criminal record, we hear about their juvenile history that is sealed, that somehow is miraculously surfaced. Although you couldn't do it legally without a court order. We hear about videotapes of alleged attempted robberies that nobody in the police department knew at the time that the person was shot. And then that narrative begins to frame the national story. Right? So the story is not about cop shoots man, unarmed man. The narrative is the tension between cop shoots unarmed man, but there are questions about how the unarmed man lived his life. Community leaders then get incensed and outraged. There are calls for protest, there are calls for marches. Then that brings in another wave of national infrastructure, the national media, the national civil rights groups and other groups. They start calling for marches. Al Sharpton comes in, Jesse Jackson comes in, the national legal advocacy people comes in, and where is the narrative about the locality? The local politics begins to disappear rapidly, and we get very concerned with the national demand. Let me just tell you what is a little bit different about Ferguson than, from that perspective, than what we normally see, is that the national media didn't really give me a sense of what was going on. It was actually Twitter. It was actually the social media, and then the independent journalists that went down to Ferguson, just as we were talking about earlier, to find out what is really going on, began to fuel a different set of stories. And if you start looking at the social media versions and the larger corporate media versions, you get very different analyses about who did what to whom, about why things are happening. But I think we can all agree that the big mistake that any police department can make, and that Ferguson Police Department made, is that the police over-responded to the community anger, and they under-responded to the pain that the community was feeling. And that's one of the worst mistakes that you can make as a police department dealing with a community in which one of their own has been killed by a police officer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, that was eloquent. So let me kind of juxtapose a couple of things that you just said, Vince, with a couple of things that, should I call you Eugene or Gene?
Gene.
Okay, thank you. So you talked about the importance of empathy and just having a sense of the community before resorting to sort of, either the defensive crouch or the attempt to frame the narrative or the overreaction. Gene, you have talked more about policy, right? So are there policy changes that you think would be, appropriate that could address some of these, I don't want to say softer concerns, but some of these concerns that would seem to be more a function of, of feel and tone and posture and strategy, as opposed to, things that you would write in a department's policy?
Well, I mean, in terms of the police business, the police officers, I was a human dignity trainer in Africa and Europe, and so I sort of understand this a little, perhaps uniquely. and certainly even in New York. One of the things that comes up with these incidents, and I think was referenced by one of the comments, is that, and I understand this, there's a tendency to make radioactive comments when things happen, but that often gets directed only at the frontline police, only frontline police people. And even arguably, I would say Attorney General Holder going in there, essentially not leveling with people. Police in our society have tremendous amounts of power. The law of self-defense is extremely favorable to the police. That's just the reality. We can have a whole conversation about why that is, but you're pandering to people when you don't tell them that, and when you go in and you try to make it an individual police issue. The other thing, when there's radioactive comments about the police, is where I come from on this is I always think, I don't know anything about the Ferguson Police Department, but I think in many police departments, there are cops that are somewhat sensitive. There's probably a big middle, and then you've got people that are just the lost cause. When you have extremist conversations, the extreme takes over in the police business also. So extremist conversations, like in New York City, I hear people say the New York City Police Department kills people all the time. Okay? That's just not true. That's just absolutely not true. And really wise people say that. It's statistically not borne out. Okay? This is one of the most restrained police departments in the world, probably. If you look at the number of incidents they're involved in, there's 50 police shootings a year out of 35,000 police people. So if I'm sitting in a precinct with cops that are there for the right reasons, they really want to be in a community. The crazy cops, the crazy people that are going to latch onto that are going to see, we don't get, no matter what we do, we're going to be criticized, right? No matter what we do, we're going to be demonized. So I think that's just one of the many, you could make a laundry list of systematic changes, but in terms of reaching individual officers, that's a crucial thing to understand. I understand why the rhetoric gets so hot, but I think if you're in the police world, you understand that it's the rare department where you don't have some good people, if not a lot of good people, that can be pushed in the right direction. And just on that, and then I'll stop, but it's a quasi-military organization, so they do take direction. And they're told to do things, they do them. They're told not to do things, they don't do them. And if we reduce the footprint of the police, we start taking out some of these laws. I just came through 14th Street and saw a sign, if you swipe a Metro card, you get arrested, right? That's in our city, that's not in Ferguson, right? We have the police overly engaged, and if we start reducing their footprint, they've got lots of other non-enforcement things they could be doing. There's a lot of service stuff they could be doing, and we need to think about reorienting the police away from, especially in a city like this that now is super safe, that we should not continue to have them out there, you know, going at full tilt like they are, and still in some communities.
So you're talking about different, like, community policing style strategies to strike a better balance. You know, you alluded in your introduction to the fact that, you know, in public housing, people want protection. And yet at the same time, you have to strike a balance because these people who are asking for protection also have this history of sort of resentful relationships with police. So you see community policing and sort of, you know, just different approaches to getting to know a community as being important to kind of change the tone nationally in relationships with, in particular, minority communities?
The problem with community policing, I'll be brief, is that it's somewhat hyped and is often not really that effective. So we had community policing in NYPD. It was often good for the working hours of the cops, but it was not. I don't think it was as good for the community as it could have been. You need to have the right people that have the right inclination. We had a sergeant in the 72nd Precinct, which has been in the news lately in Sunset Park, Andy McGoey. I don't know if any Sunset Park people are here. If you lived in Sunset Park, you knew Andy McGoey. I was talking to Councilman Albanese, if people remember Sal Albanese from Bay Ridge, and he said that he would call to Andy McGoey whatever the issues were, and Andy McGoey would go in and verbally, and not physically, not criminal justicely, he would go in and converse with people and diffuse situations. One sergeant in an entire precinct could actually be deployed to locations where there were problems and actually had the respect in the community, respect, including of people that were up to no good. He could actually do that without formalizing the process, especially with young people, not dragging them to the system. So community policing can be helpful. If I could just quickly just say, I think that's the other side of this conversation, which is police disengagement is a big problem. And in a lot of communities, that's in some ways a bigger problem than police brutality. If you look at cities like Chicago, you look at cities like Washington, Philadelphia, to some degree St. Louis, it's actually getting the police involved in citizen complaints that's the real obstacle. So you have to look at the balance here. If you get overly critical of the police, you want to put cameras on the police, you want to second guess everything you do, be advised there are lots of communities, you take the south side of Chicago, where the African-American middle class left in mass because for a lot of reasons, but failure to address quality of life was a major issue, I would say, in a lot of those communities where there was decline, economic, but also that.
So, Rembert, I know you wanted to jump in, and then Vince, you're jotting furiously, so you'll be next.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that point, which I think is a really good point. Looking at Ferguson, you can speak to this because you definitely saw it more than I did, but one of the great tensions that I saw during the protests came from people in the community addressing black cops. I remember when the highway patrol came in
Sure.
with the tanks, and like, I will never forget this. And this was one of probably my biggest takeaway from Ferguson was watching protesters have opposite ideas of how to go forward and actually talking it out loud and striking some very like rational middle ground, or just saying, hey, we just think differently about this, and it happening very loudly but peacefully. I thought that was like incredible, that was just something that could be done in a very tense situation. But one of those situations came from one of those evenings where the tanks were out there, and you had, the line of cops, and there were these 3 black cops that were all on one side, just stone-faced, having to sit there, and you had one group of protesters who were very much taking the tone of, kind of just like calling them like traitors and sellouts, and like, how could y'all be out here like at a moment like this, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had another group of people like 10 feet away, like kind of like thanking him and being like, we need you, like we need you, like we know you can't say anything right now, but like we need you to like stay on the force. And like this was happening at the same time, and they were talking at each other and then talking at the cops, the whole time the cops still can't say anything. But I think it's a really interesting again, like talking about how Ferguson isn't like every single other place. Like I've been in other protests before where it's just like when people disagree, the focal point becomes on the disagreement.
Right.
And it never, even in very tense disagreements about the cops or about anyone else, like the focus somehow still stayed on what to do next, even if that what to do next was very murky or unclear.
Right. I will add to that in Campfield Apartments, where Mike Brown was actually shot, Ferguson police officers will not go into that apartment complex right now. When he talked about disengagement, it is because their presence will incite something right now. It's gone more toward the community policing itself right now because tensions are so high. Even in the city of St. Louis, there are almost 2 unions for the police. One is the standard police union, which is basically the white union, and then there's the union for the black cops.
I was going to say, it's not almost.
Yeah.
With the fire department and the police department
that's
in the
right,
city,
I forgot fire.
there's a black union.
Yeah, there's a
and a
black
white
union and there's a white union, and that's in the city of St. Louis. So everything comes down to race, just about, and that feeds into the politics. It's been a hard watch on the line because I do have relationships with African American police officers, and I would not want to be them right now anywhere in the St. Louis area. The other night, this was Saturday night, there was an officer involved shooting, a police officer was shot in the arm in St. Louis, in the Delwood-Ferguson area. So it wasn't related to the protest, and there was almost a huge confrontation with the police again as well. People were under the assumption that they had shot and killed the assailant, which was not true. But there was just this huge backlash at the community right there on the line. And the conversations with the black officers, you need to be ashamed of yourself. How can you do this? You know, all police are pigs, and that just is not right. We need good officers. The problem is, how can they root out the ones that are wrong, but not just get out the bad officers? There's a system that needs to be fixed. So there are good officers, I think, in a system where that's what the problem is. And that's what we need to get down to. So just more black officers isn't the answer.
Vince.
Yeah, this is really interesting to talk about the Canfield apartments, because what you're telling us, what you're explaining to us, is that there was a terrible situation that happened. The body was left out. All of this stuff happened. Now, one of the results is that the police can't go back. We're making the decision
Correct.
not to go back. Half the community doesn't want them back. The other half of the community, as Gene might say, is how come the cops aren't here, because it hasn't gotten any better. So let's sort of look at that particular piece. You know, this is why I think it's useful to think about it as a system as opposed to individual social interactions, because, you know, as Gene was talking earlier about messaging and what police officers hear when people are overly critical, and we're talking about what communities hear when police departments are overreacting, that what you end up with, perhaps from a policy perspective or maybe an organizational development perspective, is how do you, number one, keep the people that are going to be the agents for change motivated to do so? How do you not demotivate the police department to act right? How do you not demotivate the community to act right? But more importantly, or equally as important, it's about identifying the leaders, the people that are actually going to make the change. And so, you know, the police chief, I'll put it this way, Ray Kelly, just bring it back to New York, when he was the police commissioner of police here in New York City, was not going to be the agent of change to change stop and frisk. He just wasn't. We had litigation going. You know, everybody was pushing op-eds. It just wasn't going to happen because he was the wrong guy. Bill Bratton, I have my real criticisms of Bill Bratton, but Bill Bratton may be the right guy. But the point there is that the type of changes that need to happen on the police side and the community side need the right type of leadership. And sometimes the people that are making the most noise, or the people that are saying the outrageous comments, are not the people that are capable of shifting the dialogue from what we're fighting to what we're building. And so the piece I wanted to say was that CCR, I sent 3 staff down to Ferguson on that first weekend. I'm going down myself in a couple of weeks. But one of the things that we've been focusing on in terms of litigation is not what are the big cases we're going to file, but it's actually looking at the social justice infrastructure, who are the leaders in the social justice infrastructure in Ferguson. How has that developed? From what I understand, there are a lot of people that are in good positions of power, but there's little experience with social justice protest, with organizing, and a lot of that stuff is coming in from the outside, which can be dangerous. But I'm very interested in identifying the leaders that have the compelling conversation with the power structures that say, here's the 5 things that need to change. Here are the 5 timeframes in which we want it. Let's talk about how we're going to do it.
So let me go with, Peter, let me ask you a question about the nature of the police force. You wrote in your longer piece about the disparity between the population, the residents, and the police force. We've all probably read about that at this point. 53 police in Ferguson, 3 of them black. Yeah. A town that's about 70% black. A police force that's about 6% black. So that's clearly an issue. And then a related issue is the mentality that you saw, I think the first or second night of the protest, when we heard a cop refer to the protesters as bleeping animals. And that's a mentality that I used to see and interpret as sort of like a zookeeping mentality. Yeah. They didn't live there. They were coming in to take care of the animals. Yeah. So that's economics that's closely related to economics and jobs. Delve into that piece of it a little bit.
I want to go back to something you said in your introduction, which is that you went on all night sorties or whatever they are with the cops, and you saw you saw some basically good people and some maybe not always so good people. And same thing with the victims. And then you saw the fact that when the white cops were dealing with white families, it was different from dealing with black families. I think what we're seeing here is the system drives people to be not their best, brings out the worst in people. And I think what's happening in Ferguson is actually, that's continued. We're not getting the healing that we need to be getting. It's true, I tend to think economics. That's why I keep going back to the 19th century, which seems like so long ago. But there was an original sin. The original sin was when the city of St. Louis said, we're going to separate ourselves from what was that time farmland. Mm-hmm. It became St. Louis County because we had to keep all the money for ourselves here in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the result, of course, was that when people started moving out past the city limits, they couldn't annex it the way most cities do as they grow. I mean, New York City, you know, became Brooklyn and so on. And that was greed involved there. Also in St. Louis County, as the municipalities formed, sometimes they were trying to capture local revenue, sometimes they were trying to exclude blacks. Mistakes that were made long ago are having repercussions today, and I think it's going to be very hard for Ferguson to heal, but I think one lesson we can take away from this is don't go down that path, because it can be very hard to pull back from it once the damage is done.
I mean, the cities need federal help. That's self-evident at this point. You can't say to Camden, New Jersey, good luck with, I mean, so it's not a very dated problem. It's a current problem. The cities are being starved from, people know there used to be federal revenue sharing. The federal government used to have a responsibility for this. They've stepped out of it completely. And now the cops are the revenue people. They stand on the side of the road and raise the taxes. That's a scandal, really, if you think about it.
And I would like to address when he said Ferguson Healing. It's almost to the point where realistically, Ferguson is not ready to heal yet, because we're still pulling back. If people rush to healing right now, they're not going to deal with all of the real issues. So it's like we're still pulling the scab back and finding out how deep does this go, and people need to be allowed to do that. I think when people say, oh, it is time to heal, no, it's still time to get down to what the issues are, and then we can start talking about healing.
Yeah, and you talked about, Peter, you talked about the economics. Yeah. And you talked about the fact that, you know, the original sin was St. Louis City wanting to keep the money for themselves, not wanting to spend money on like fire service out to these outlying areas. And now the problem is in reverse, which is St. Louis County, with a lot of affluent areas and overwhelmingly white, is totally opposed to having the city join the county now. You know, about 2/3 of St. Louis County is opposed. And so you really have it, you know, kind of it goes both ways. Yes. And we're kind of reaping what we sowed there. So let's talk a little bit about healing, and kind of where we are, and whether you think, I just want to I want to kind of compare what you're hearing to what I'm hearing. Talk to us both about blacks in the region and whites in the region, and where you think people are, not just in terms of the healing process, but in terms of what we need to do to move forward, i.e. changing the demographic composition of police forces. Number 2, changing the policies and revenue structures whereby these small departments are disproportionately reliant on traffic stops. And 3, more broadly, about economic opportunity in North St. Louis County, which, you know, is underlying so much of this. Right. The you know, unemployment rates among young black males, 30, 40, 50% in some of these areas. Right.
So there's I'll start out with the white perspective, because there are people who don't think that there's a problem. Or
the problem is, why don't these people let the system work?
Yes. Yeah. Take for instance the very well-meaning, I know you've seen the I Love Ferguson campaign, very well-meaning, to show that they love their city, They love what Ferguson is about, but at the flip side, for people who are angry, it's almost, they read it as things are fine, nothing needs to change.
Can you explain? Maybe everyone hasn't seen that campaign, so explain.
Okay.
Give a little context.
So there's a campaign that was started by the former mayor Brian Fletcher to help raise money for the businesses who were affected by the rioting, and it's on a white T-shirt or on a white poster. More of them are yard signs that says "I Heart Ferguson," and they're found more so in the white part of Ferguson, and the T-shirts. And what initially started, people still are very angry about it because they read it as white Ferguson people started this, and it says that they love Ferguson, and they feel that it doesn't address that there's anything really wrong. That's how it's being, interpreted from one side. The other side that started it is just saying we love our community. It's not a bad community. That we don't like how we're being portrayed, and we want to, help get things right here. So there's a whole miscommunication about the idea of what I love Ferguson and what the city stands for and how it should move forward. So, but some people do feel that, oh, well, if black people just voted in Ferguson, all of this would be fixed. If black people just got more engaged in Ferguson, we wouldn't be at this problem. And that's not what the reality is. Because in the St. Louis region, you have the people who are residents of Ferguson and registered voters of Ferguson clearly have their work cut out for them in dealing with trying to create a civilian review board. So that's one of the major things that's going on right now. And every Thursday, me and a group of other elected officials, the county councilwoman, Hazel Irby, and 3 state reps, and the only African American on the city council, we've been hosting these meetings every Thursday to teach people government. It was heartbreaking to hear people furious and enraged about what's going on, Ferguson residents who do not participate in the political process and did not have any idea of how it worked. They didn't know when the elections are, didn't know what ward they live in, they didn't know how many wards there were, they didn't know who their city council people are. So we're starting at a very basic level of education. And this isn't your typical voter education where they show you what ID to bring and who's on the ballot. This is civics 101 that people have not been paying attention to and need to quickly get caught up to speed in order to help drive the reforms in their own city. So that's the focus for residents, that they need to get engaged and involved at the city council. They need to understand what the responsibilities of the county council are, because they're also St. Louis County residents, which is another different level form of government.
And just to elaborate a little bit on what you talked about, white Ferguson feels, one of the things that I found in my interviews was that a lot of white Ferguson and Ferguson in general, I think 3 months ago, was seen as a model within North St. Louis County of an integrated community. Yeah. Now, on the block level, it's not very integrated, but it's a town that is rare in North St. Louis County in that once it went 50-60% black, it didn't go 98% black quickly like most of the towns do east of there. Correct. And so a lot of white Fergusonians are like, we're the good guys. We stayed. We invested in our community and don't feel, I'm just representing their viewpoint here.
No, it is. People do not understand that there is a huge difference in diversity and inclusion. Just because he and I are sitting next to each other, that doesn't mean that he is listening to me or taking in my viewpoint or that he's encouraging me to actively participate in what he and I can create. We're just sitting next to each other and, ooh, this is a diverse panel. It is not the same thing. And that is a major problem in St. Louis. They say diversity, diversity, diversity. Just because you let me in the room doesn't mean that I'm a part of the conversation.
So, Patricia, you talked about the hard work of teaching people about their rights.
Correct.
And teach me about democracy. And Vince, this is the work that you've been engaged in for many, many years. Let me ask you, how do you teach people? We just saw what happened in South Carolina. Did you guys see that footage of the black man? He's getting out of his car at a gas station. The cop comes up to him with a gun, screams, get out of the car. Guy gets out of the car. He screams, let me see your license. The guy ducks back into his car to get his wallet where he has his license, and the cop shoots him several times in the hip. And you can hear him plaintively asking on the ground, why did you shoot me?
Yep.
What did I do? Why did you shoot me? In this context, and fortunately, I think what we're seeing in the aftermath is a little bit different. He was immediately fired and is apparently going to be, prosecuted. He was indicted. So that's encouraging because this is a pretty clear, egregious instance of misconduct. But how do we teach people in this context to learn their rights and to do the hard work of figuring out what they can and can't do when so many times they feel as if the other side isn't operating in a similar context?
No, that's a great question. I actually watched that video about 10 times. I was commenting on MSNBC about it. And after the 5th time, I was analyzing it, what did the cop do? What did the person do? After the 5th time, I began to feel so sad because what clearly happened was, it was a bad shooting. There's no question about it. I think most police officers would say that. But there were really kind of 2 pieces that bothered me, and they relate to teaching. One was that it's about how police officers are trained to react in situations, and then it's also particularly about how black families train their children to act in police situations. There's a lot of policy discussion about police and training. We don't have a lot of policy discussions about black family training, but I'm here to tell you it happens, right? And so here's the takeaway, is that you tell your children to stand up for their rights, to know what their rights are, and to don't let people take advantage of them in all other circumstances except for one, and that is when it involves a police officer, in which you then train your children to say, well, regardless of what your rights are, the best thing you can do is to move slowly, be polite, and follow the orders. That man in South Carolina did all of that, and the takeaway is that even when you do that, you can end up getting shot, which is a tremendous problem. But here's the training piece that I'm stuck with, and I don't have a solution here, but I'm going to raise a policy question, which is the 4th Amendment as it relates to civilians and as it relates to police officers. The 4th Amendment of the Constitution protects civilians from unreasonable searches and seizures by government. And that we have street stops, Terry stops, where police officers are legitimately allowed to stop people if they think that they have, in New York, if they are about to, or if they will immediately commit a crime. And in those stops, the 4th Amendment does allow a person to say, hey, why are you stopping me? That is a legitimate thing. In the police training, very often, and let me put it this way. Very often, the way that police react to that is that non-compliance equals escalation. I think we heard about this here. So you can have a scenario where you want to engage in a dialogue in a street stop where the police officer is seeing this as a more dire situation, and you're engaging in a dialogue creates an escalation. So it's very easy to end up face down on the floor with your hands behind your back with backup being called if you don't comply with what's happening. And so the challenge with training people about knowing what your rights are in the abstract is great, and everybody should know it, and particularly around civics, but navigating those rights in a street stop with particular police officers can become really, really troubling. And I think that we actually disempower the constitutional interaction by the way we have to train our young men to survive.
So, Gene, and then I'll get you, remember.
Sure.
So following on that, one of the things that I think a lot of people found disturbing when looking at Missouri statute and trying to figure out where is this case going to go legally is that the statute, I think I'm getting the wording right here, Patricia, correct me if I'm wrong, says that as long as the officer feels that, again, the officer feels that he is under threat,
correct,
then basically he can use force.
Yes.
And I think it's like, according to an objectively reasonable person, that he could, feel threatened. Who is that person who's is that a white person? Is that a black person? Is that a white person who's had a certain set of life experiences that make him feel threatened? How do we determine that? And do you think, what are your thoughts on that standard about use of force?
Well, not to bore people, but in this state, it's a mixed analysis. It's an objective, reasonable standard, but it's also subjectivized. So here's what it's supposed to be. It's hard to actually express, but it's knowing what the police officer basically know and being in the situation the police officer was in. And that's why, to back up, you have to get the politics right. The politics have to be right. How big do you want the police footprint to be in the city? When you send the police forward, you cannot deny, there's a denial. When you send the police forward, it is a significant intrusion into people's lives, okay? When they're pulling people over, when they're ordering people out of the car, they are armed themselves, right? So they're thinking worst case scenario always, okay? So there's never an innocent, harmless kind of police interaction. It's always monumental. And Vince mentioned stop and frisk in New York. Anybody here who was in the Giuliani era saw how bad the politics could be in a city, right? The politics were awful, okay? Those politics were the ends justify the means. It's about time we got after those people. And regrettably, the Bloomberg administration, I guess in the last year, got it right eventually, but did thousands and thousands and thousands of stops and questions and frisks, and that put the cops into these situations, again, this quasi-military organization where the cops are ordered to do this stuff. It's not their idea to do it. They were told and required to do it. And so finally now we've got sort of a right sizing of this enforcement. It should never be done lightly. The whole idea of a Terry stop is you're looking at legitimate, suspicious conduct. Somebody is surveilling a store and is going to rob it, not to throw a dragnet over the city. And again, getting the politics right, it has to be said the city council in this city utterly failed. For how many years did they fail in their oversight responsibilities of the police department to be a force in the city? They allowed the police department to do this without any kind of weighing in, any kind of meaningful oversight. The record is just clear about that. They were not around to take the executive branch to task on that issue.
Robert, you wanted to jump in, and I got a question for you after you do, so
Okay.
go.
So I have like I have a very not difficult, but I go back and forth a lot about the idea of, you know, I guess how to train a young black man in these situations. You know, like I'm 27. When I shave, I look like 19, and so like I have been in situations where, like, after having my like 18 years of under my mom's rule, like her explaining to me how to stay safe or, you know, how to be around police or whatnot. I have all those in the front of all those lessons in the front of my mind, but there are also times when the knowing your rights, and like I think knowing your rights is perhaps the most important thing. To know when you are in public and in situations that could be dicey, where knowing your rights starts to bleed into, you know, this conversation about like needing to fully present yourself one way 100% of the time. Like the idea of like not ever wearing certain things, the idea of like never wearing hoodies, like the idea of that type of stuff, which, yes, like, I guess in a world, if you never wore a hoodie, then you would always be slightly less scary to that police officer that might be on the lookout for people in hoodies. But you also, at some point, you have to draw a line and be like, well, can I just be myself? You know, and it's a very hard thing to do because you want, like, as a young black man, I want to live something that resembles like a carefree life at times, but you also know that there's a line for that also, and I think it's a conversation that has to continue to happen, and because I know that at times, like when I was down in Ferguson, for example, and it was kind of before the big media onslaught came down, where there weren't designated media staging areas. It was just like, if you want to be down here, you're going to be with everyone else. And, you know, I didn't have a credential. I was wearing something similar to what I'm wearing now, and there was nothing distinguishing me from a community member in Ferguson. I just looked like a young guy down there. And, you know, there was a part of me that was
I mean, you didn't get all dressed up like you did today for us.
It's a pocket. You know, there was a moment where I was like, well, should I, when I went down Wednesday night when there were the tanks and everything, you know, there was a part of me where it was like, I feel like my time down here would be a little bit safer if, like, I wore a suit, had a badge, had, like, my notebook out, you know, something like that. But then I was also, like, I'm not special. Like, I'm not any different than anyone else down here. Like, I grew up in a neighborhood in Atlanta very similar to Ferguson, and it feels very familiar, and all these lawns are really nicely manicured. This is, like, a really nice middle-class neighborhood. This is not, like, the projects. And I feel safe here. The only people I'm afraid of are the cops, not the people that live here. And I think, I just think when there are conversations about how to talk to youth about, you know, how to stay safe, there has to be two sides of it, because you don't want to strip all identity, you know.
So I think that any conversation that we have about rights is inextricably intertwined with conversations about media coverage of these things, because now it seems that so many of these violent interactions are taped by citizen bystanders using cell phones and then social media to distribute them. How did you see cops? First of all, do you think this created more anger or resentment among cops to have so many people taping their every move?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. And what does this augur for future media coverage of incidents like this?
The thing that I find most interesting when we talk about the know your rights thing is that now everybody has a camera, even including the police, which I would like to know what are the policies around, because they seem to be able to turn them on and off as they choose to. So yeah, that's another part of policy conversation with the cameras. And especially with the interactions with the police and the media coverage. So to piggyback off of the rights thing, and right now the ACLU, they were in court yesterday, they might be in court today, with this 5-second rule that was created by certain police officers, and it needed to be on tape, you know, so that way people know police officers were telling people that if they stop walking for 5 seconds on the sidewalk, they could be arrested. So this is make up your own rules kind of as you go. And I've said countless times, if I was not here, or not here, but there all the time, to see some of the stuff and hear some of the stuff for myself, I would not believe this kind of stuff. So we are at the point where the police we're talking about loitering, we're bringing out the ordinances, we're looking at what is lawful assembly and getting right down to knowing your rights and understanding that, but also knowing we need to have somebody in the background to film this, because it's almost as if a group of black people protesting will not be believed, like a group of black eyewitnesses will not be believed. We always feel like we need to have some proof. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. With the Ferguson media coverage right now, there's a vocal group within the protesters who do not like the media. They have run off reporters, have told them, do not come here, do not come back. We don't like the way that you're covering us, and they are given the message to leave, to take off. There was a story that was gotten wrong. This was Thursday night when the police started the melee, when Chief Jackson started to walk with the protesters, and a local reporter initially got the story out that the protesters were attacking the chief. Now, I got angry. That is not what happened. And there's a lot that goes on out there. You cannot see everything. And that's some of here's what the camera is. Let's look and see what goes on, and you need different angles before it gets reported.
So let me, thank you. Let me ask the two journalists about kind of media responsibility in all this. The first several nights, I was up all night just watching, right? I couldn't take my eyes off it. And I realized, I'm part of the problem, right? Because there's 98% of the people I know and trust that I talk to that are on the ground, they tell me that 98% of the people are not breaking into stores and are just marching peacefully. But just like other people, you know, millions of people around the country, I can't take my eyes off it, and the media is showing me the worst aspects of those evenings, which is then being projected around St. Louis, the rest of St. Louis County, many of the people who control the resources that could improve these situations, and of course the rest of the country and the rest of the world. Without context, without an acknowledgement that this is a very, very small subset of the people who have been protesting. You know, did the media fall down on the job by not placing that in context?
Yes. I am not here to represent all of the media. Okay? So hold your rotten tomatoes. First of all, I'm a print journalist, and I think a lot of the issues are with TV, because, you know, TV goes for flames. Flames are really good on camera, and brawls and smoke. By the way, the TV can also make the cops look bad. You know, when the cops come in with their truncheons and so on, but it gravitates towards conflict, violence. TV doesn't do as well with zoning laws and stuff like that, right? It's just it's not photogenic.
Or the things that you wrote about, these municipal structures and fragmentation that lead to a lot of the underlying anger.
Right, and another thing about the TV, and this one would apply to the internet, and businessweek.com is part of the internet, is this immediacy. People have this hunger. They want to know the latest, and so, and sometimes it's just feeding this whatever the latest thing is gets magnified because it's the latest breaking news, even if it's a tiny development, even if it's wrong. And you mentioned an example of something that was wrong. People all want to beat each other because with Twitter and so on, after something happens, within 5 seconds, it's going out to the rest of the country. And so people want to try to keep on top of that. We all need to take a deep breath. I'm very sorry to hear, I didn't know about this, that there's a segment of the protesters who just want the media out. I understand that instinct. I think in the long term it's a bad reaction.
I agree.
But to answer your question again, yes, it is a problem.
Yeah, and I totally understand that instinct after feeling misrepresented, you know, for so much of the last several weeks. Vince, you want to jump in?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Rembert.
Yeah, and this is quick, but one of the reasons I left was because I felt like the story started being about the journalists. And
after like Wesley Lowery and
that's not on them. That's just on. I was actually headed to meet Wesley at that McDonald's that he got arrested at, but it took a wrong turn. I'm kind of glad I did.
We're referring to the Washington Post writer who was arrested in the McDonald's on the Wednesday night that things really blew up in terms of the media.
And I think that was, you know, the media likes to be the star. Like, the media loves it when the story becomes about the media. It's very, like, meta and self-referential and, like, pat on the backy. And that's what was happening. And it started to take away, like, you could read 10 things and, like, forget that this was about someone that got shot. Like, you would be focused on, like, freedom of the press.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I was like, I believe in freedom of the press a lot, but, like, that is not the number one issue here. That is like the number 30 issue here, you know? And, like, so yeah, I think the media definitely has a responsibility. I think what you were saying, I think when the TV crews got down there, that was the moment where I was like, this is great because they're going to be able to, like, you know, if Jake Tapper is walking through the streets, like, people are going to, like, actually start to believe this for the first time because, like, yo, Jake Tapper's out here.
Out here saying this is absurd.
Yeah,
the level of militarization is absurd on camera in a very spontaneous and genuine way.
Yeah, 100%. The flip side to that is that with TV, often with, you know, breaking news sources, like, you need a story. You can't just, like, present what you see. You need, like, an angle. And a lot of times the angles that were happening were very disingenuous, and that was a shame to see, because you hope everyone is down there for the right reason. You hope everyone is tweeting what they see for the right reasons, or tweeting actual things instead of just like, I just saw this thing like happen, when sometimes it's not even happening. You're just, this idea of like becoming a star off of a tragedy. You hate to see that happen, but it happens,
But you know what I will say, when the journalists started getting arrested, to me, and to several other people really involved in the situation, welcome to St. Louis County PD. If they don't care about your First Amendment rights, with your camera and with your national megaphone, what do you think is happening to people who actually live here? You're not too good to get a taste of what it's like. Welcome. And that's what it felt like for those of us who were here. It wasn't, oh, the media is a part of the story. No, come get you some. You will not be exempt, and I think that is what it took to really get the attention, and that's what happened. So it became not just about Mike Brown, but then that's when we really started getting into the other things that drove that, the police and the not caring about people's rights. That's what it took.
Yeah. And hopefully the media memories of those things will help give this more sustained attention, over the next 6 months, year, for follow-up to see what's going on, because it lets the media know, like, if they're doing this when the eyes of the world are on you, what do you think it's going to look like in 6 months when all the cameras go away? I'm going to get some questions from the audience, and wow, okay, you have been the most persistent. This young lady you. Young lady? Well, yeah.
I wanted to pick up on some of the things that the questions that Vincent Warren was raising about the issue of trying to get away from what we're fighting to what we're building, and the whole issue of trying to locate leadership in communities like Ferguson all over the country that are dealing, I'm sorry, the phrase that you used had to do with social infrastructure.
Social justice infrastructure.
And to also pick up on things that Robert Brown noticed when he was there, the whole issue that people really want to dialogue with each other. Yeah. They don't really want to go out and destroy their communities. They want to be able to communicate with one another, to disagree without fighting, to understand that disagreement is part of that inclusion, a part of being included. And also the issue of policy that you brought up about, you noted that Barack Obama, that the president had been able to institute policies of opening up the dimension of mental illness in policing. But the other part of that is to open up the dimension of people's needs and desires to participate and communicate with one another and develop their community voices. And that also, I think, is reflected in the issue of people saying to the reporters, get out of here. We don't need you. We need each other. Right. And if you can't report who we really are and what we really want, we don't need you. And that also reflects on a program that PBS had about Ferguson, where at one point the young women, people of color there, actually said, we don't want another Martin Luther King. We don't want another great and powerful Oz telling, and the impulse behind that is that we want to take charge of our own lives and listen to each other. And so I really want to, because I think that's kind of where you were heading, but also to make a policy that says, the national policy or the state policy, or what, we need to provide the training and the support for people to develop this social justice infrastructure leadership in their own communities. And I know
Do you have a question?
I know, no, it's a
Okay.
comment.
Okay.
But that's the comment that I mean, it's a comment and a question, but I want to just try to pull that out of there. I also just wanted to say, and I have to say this, to Robert Brown, as a woman, I feel that way all the time. I just want to be myself, okay? You know, I don't want to have, so I just want to say that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Give somebody the mic.
To look at the other side of the story for a second, context, you get the rhetoric that there's a flood out there, there's a tide, and like King Cuchulainn of Ireland who battled the tide, there's a sense of panic and desperation. We tend to look at the individual who's harmed, you know, tides and floods of immigration, some tide. But it's not in the mind of the people who are looking at it in terms of the tide that's rolling in, then that has to be stopped. And I think that's the real dilemma. Individual tragedy versus mentality of a statistical look and a social look at what's happening in terms of how the police look at it.
Right there. Okay.
Hello. Oh, I have a question for Eugene O'Donnell, and if anyone else wants to add anything, please. But I wonder if relations between people and the police could be ameliorated if there was some reform in the curriculum for the cadets or the police in training. I wonder if the police were required to pass classes in human rights, ethics, morality, if that would improve the situation. And in that case, what are they learning, and what is the connection between what they're learning and how they relate to the public, and how transparent is the curriculum of the police departments?
Well, because people want to ask questions, I'll be quick. I wrote something for the Times on this. I think it's time in law enforcement to have a zero tolerance for racism among cops. They should be the people that own that. And we got to find a way to do that. The profession should not tolerate it. The outside people want to talk about race, that's fine. You can have any politics you want. You can have any disagreement you want. Racial rhetoric, disparaging racial rhetoric, should have no place in law enforcement. And the piece that I wrote in the Times said they've actually done this in European soccer to some degree. Is basically have any ideas you want, have any thoughts you want. Racist commentary shouldn't be allowed in our workplace, and it shouldn't be top down. See, this should not be imposed, because that doesn't work. Okay, we need to have people really embrace this, and that to me would be because having people just come in and lecture does not work.
So this sort of has to do with the new Jim Crow and the Fourth Amendment, which Vincent touched on. Is there a way to reassemble the Fourth Amendment? Because a lot of it has been dismantled with stop and frisk policies, and this is, again, sort of a policy thing, and it affects people of color disproportionately. But can you just sort of say, okay, the Supreme Court has done this, but we can, you know, reintegrate certain policies or certain rights that have been dismantled, or does it have to sort of completely unravel and start again?
That's a great question. I think you know, there's in some ways there's a lot wrong with the Fourth Amendment, but in most ways there's nothing wrong with the Fourth Amendment in the sense that it creates a bright line rule, societal understanding about where your rights, where it's actually where the police or government practices have to stop. That's sort of the bubble around your rights. So in that way, there's nothing wrong with it. But here's the problem that we have is that government doesn't like the Fourth Amendment, right? And so if we tinker with it, then we run the risk of having, as opposed to death by 1,000 cuts, which is what we have now, we run the risk of just throwing the whole thing out. And if we throw that whole thing out, we're living in a very different society than we're living in now. So I think the answer really is about more deeply engaging the question of what does it mean to have governments what does it mean? What does it mean to have hardline limitations on government, regardless of what the tide is, regardless of who's attacking who, ISIS or Al Qaeda or black people in the hood or the Bloods or the Crips or drug dealers coming up from South America? Where the discussion should be, how does the Fourth Amendment withstand all of those things? Because it is those things today, and it will be different things tomorrow. And we react in a very episodic way in this country. We say, "Oh my God, yeah, I know the framers, a couple hundred years ago thought that, but they had no idea that we were going to have, ISIL and ISIS and all these other kind of stuff." So then there is a tendency societally to say, yeah, that's really bad, and we certainly don't want to box ourselves into being defenseless around these threats. But it's actually, what we're doing is we're boxing ourselves in to be defenseless around the erosion of our rights if we allow the fears of the day to create a conversation about how we should change that bright line.
Let me get. Oh, my bad. Thanks.
Hi, I had a question in regards to the Civilian Review Board that you were working on. We see how that works in New York City, especially between the Giuliani and Bloomberg administrations, and how usually they're either very complacent or on the side of the police officers. So with that, and well, with New York being the city where policing is sort of effective, how can you take the mistakes of what the CCRB have done here and possibly build on that in Ferguson?
Is that for me?
Yeah, well, for you as well as Mr. Warren and Mr. O'Donnell. Well, I'll say what, there was an ordinance that was proposed, it was 2 pages, by the city of Ferguson, and that's pretty light for a review board, and they have kind of tabled that and have said they've reached out to the organization, the National Association, I forget, I see the letter acronym, but they deal with Civilian Review Board, and they're working with them to develop one. Simultaneously, even last week, I had some experts in Civilian Review Board come in and discuss with the community what is a Civilian Review Board. People, one, I want to make sure the community is engaged in this conversation. They know what a Civilian Review Board is. They are aware of what it can do, because if you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know what to ask. So of all the different models and the hybrids, we're looking at something that works for the community, considering it is a small community. There may or may not be, it certainly won't be on the level of scale here in St. Louis, in New York City. This is a 53 officers, a small community, and they don't have too many shootings or killings, but the idea of accountability, transparency, and being able to hold the officers accountable are extremely important. Also, being able to get input from all sides. So even officers, if they want to make an anonymous complaint, that's an outlet for them to be able to raise a red flag as to what's going on. So trying to work with everyone to build something like that, considering that this is a small community. That's what I'm personally working on.
Good morning. Question and a comment. I'm a retired New York City police officer. I think it's important that we ask the question regarding what is the place of police in this society. And I ask that question because there are communities where community policing is happening. And in those communities, those are the communities that control the police. As a young officer, when I worked on the Upper East Side, it was not uncommon for me to go to a doorman building and be asked to use the service entrance. So police in this society are actually servants. And when they have that role, the community is in control and tells the police what to do. In the Harlem community, communities of color do not have control of the police. So in those communities, there's no community policing. But on the Upper East Side, community policing is alive and well, and you see that in the form of members of that community having direct access to call the commanding officer at the precinct and demand that action gets taken. Those communities are called letter-writing communities. In letter-writing communities, they have control of the police. So we're not having this conversation about police behavior. So we really need to understand that in this country, police officers are servants. They should be under the control of the community and not the other way around. And as long as we have that relationship turned upside down, that's when we encounter some of the problems that we have now. So when do we put the police back into the role that this society intended them to have? And that role is the American people are in control of the police and not the other way around. So when do we begin to frame it and turn the relationship back into its right perspective?
Any thoughts, Gene?
Quick. Civics 101. It is Civics 101, and that's at the ground level. There are elected officials in the city, minority elected officials, who are excellent, okay? But we do suffer from a shortage of good elected officials, because when they're engaged with the police, commanding officers do come on the phone, they do take care. This is one of the most responsive agencies in government, the police department in this city. If you know who to call and who to ask to do things, you can get it done. And it does get, and the differential from community to community is amazing. I'm not sure it's just, because I know there are minority elected officials who are very conscientious and are on the phones and take care of business. And the police department will respond in a way that DOE won't, for example.
Vince?
I wanted just to quickly respond and add my voice to both of the questions. There actually is a proposal out there in terms of what we should be, how we should be building that we're employing in the stop and frisk case. It's called the joint reform process, and we actually got this model. This was something that was done very successfully in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati at the time was, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, had 14, 15 police shootings. There were 15 different lawsuits, and they actually came together around the table and did the following thing very quickly. Number one, they brought together the police brass, the police union, and for those of you that don't know, there is a world of difference between the police brass and the police and the police rank and file in the union, which I think is a brilliant, it's something that never occurred to me as a civil rights person, but it is a brilliant way to actually get to the heart of the issue as to what's wrong internally and what needs to get fixed. And then city officials, as well as religious communities, and most importantly, community-based organizations, so that you actually bring people to the table. They actually funded a study in the community where everybody had a chance to sort of say, here are the things we'd want to fix, here are the things we need to change, and they entered into a reform process together. And the results, I mean, you can look it up, the results have been really interesting, and it's resulted in, for example, the first female police union head. It created leaders within the police department. It created trusting relationships between really, radical communities of color in the neighborhood and police brass in ways that we've never seen in this country. So we're trying to institute that in New York, Cincinnati. We're trying to institute that in New York at the end of our stop and frisk case. Ironically enough, the union is appealing an aspect of our case, which is going to be argued. But the point there is that there is a community model, and actually, when I come down to Ferguson, I would love to kind of talk with you more about it in the next week or so. That may not be a good fit for a 50-person police force, but it could be a really interesting model about who you might need at the table to think not so much about the CCRB model, which is how do we just hold accountable, but what are we actually going to build together, and how do we want to shift both community and police culture around policing.
So all of you braved the morning rush hour to be out here, but there are millions of people tuning in on our live stream, and we want to honor their viewing by giving them the last word, the last question here, because I think it's a provocative one. One of the questions from our live stream viewers is, can I ask the panel, if the need to police street crimes is at an all-time low, then when will law enforcement turn its energies to prosecuting white-collar crimes on Wall Street? Peter?
Well, I don't see cops with the guns in their holsters walking to the Goldman Sachs lobby and taking the elevator up, even the service elevator. I don't know that's going to happen.
Service elevator.
And it kind of goes back. It kind of goes back to the ladies' insight about letter writing. I mean, they're not just letter writers; they're check writers.
Yeah.
Right.
So, listen. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the wonderful panel. And we hope we'll see you at future events. Thank you.